Well, here we are again in Owatonna, Minnesota, and we're here visiting with my good friend Matt Mollenhauer, and we affectionately call him Mini Moose because his dad is Bob Mollenhauer, who of course we always called Moose from the time we were in Vietnam, and that just stuck. So first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time out to be with us today. And as you know, we're doing interviews with the veterans, and this is an oral history of what's going on. And so the reason that I really wanted to meet with you is because you were the reason that our fishing program got started through Cabela's. And I would like to have you just take a minute, if you will, and tell us how that, I mean, from the start, just how did you ever get the idea for that?
Well, basically, it started with my dad coming to me and saying that, hey, we want to do a fishing trip with the vets. And I had just actually been on my first reunion with mom and dad, so I said, sure, let's get it going. I went to the general manager at that time of the store here in Owatonna, where I work, and asked him to sponsor us. And he threw in the first trip, he threw in a little bait, some tackle, and a few things. And we went fishing. And then it progressively got better from there.
And they also sent some professional fishermen up to the lake 2 days in advance, right? Tell us about that.
Yes, we actually had Clay Peterson, and then he brought in a friend of his to go up and pre-fish the lake to make sure we could get on some fish, which they did pretty good pre-fishing, but it didn't turn out so well during the week, but we got into some. So it was nice that they paid those guys to go. They also gave us a boat, so they paid for the boat and the fuel and all the expense that's involved with that. And then a couple of years later, we decided to do it again.
It was every off year of the reunion.
Correct.
In other words, 1 year was the reunion, and then the fishing trip, and then the reunion. Okay.
Yes. And this first year, I had noticed that Dick Glover hadn't been fishing because he has some disabilities. So Clay and I got together in that following year and went to our general manager, and we ended up building him a rod holder so he could catch fish for the first time
Basically, it
in
was
40
designed
years.
so that a one-armed person could,
Could handle it.
yep.
And he actually caught his first fish with me and Doc and Mr. Brandow and Smokes all on a pontoon. And I think that was his first fish he had caught since Vietnam. So it was pretty cool.
What do you think, if you were there and you saw his reaction, what do you think his reaction was?
I don't know, elation, excitement, sad, happy, all at the same time.
Yep.
He wouldn't say much for quite some time. So we all sat quietly in the boat and helped him reel in his fish. And then we got some pictures later, so it was pretty
Yep.
cool. But yeah, we had a lot of fun doing it. I know that Clay's always willing to go fishing, so we had a blast doing it. And we had great sponsorship through Cabela's. That following year, it was quite a bit more. I believe they sent up 2 boats. They supplied all the bait, the rods, the reels, all the tackle. They paid 4 guys or 3 guys to go. So they spent quite a bit of money and put in a lot of time and effort, especially allowing a lot of their staff and some of the higher ranking staff to leave for a week to go fishing.
I want you to back up just a little bit. And before we ever, they invited us to the store as a group.
Yes.
Of vets. Can you go back and start at your dad's house where we were gathered and tell us that story?
Well, when we decided to do this, we decided Cabela's and my general manager and myself at that time decided we don't do anything that we aren't going to go all in. So we decided to surprise you guys. Everybody stayed at Dad's house, which is south of town, and I arranged with one of my former employers, the Steele County Sheriff's Office, to give us a police escort. So we picked everybody up in the Cabela's van. We had a police escort, full tilt, lights and sirens all the way into town. Then Cabela's rolled out the red carpet, which I'm pretty sure everybody was surprised by. We served a meal up in the deli. There was a couple of presentations. And then we packed up and headed out.
There's one thing that you missed,
What'd I miss?
and it might have been the most, I don't know the correct word. What happened when we walked through the front doors?
Oh, the entire staff, store, customers, everybody formed two lines and gave appreciation for the service they had done, yes.
And how did us vets react?
Pretty much full tears.
Yep.
In fact, if I remember, that was the first time you've been at a loss for words.
Yep.
Which-
That's a fact.
So-
And then there was one of the employees that was a good singer.
Yep, sang the national anthem.
Do you
Yep,
remember
that
who
was
that
Seth.
was? Okay.
Yeah, he no longer works for Cabela's anymore, but yeah, he was more than willing.
But that was professional grade.
Yeah,
I mean, that
he's-
was amazing.
pretty amazing.
Yep. And then you had a friend that made tips one year, the marinated,
Oh yes, they were actually the pork chops
no, this was,
or the tri-tips.
that's right.
Tri-tips,
yeah.
yes. That was actually up here at Medford Meats. They donated all of that. I think it was the third time we went up is when Geneva Meats donated all the pork chops. We had 40 pork chops. That year, Cabela's also donated a Yeti cooler for our use. They let us use the Traeger pellet grill to make those and the smokers. So,
And I also remember that they extended employee pricing to all of us if anybody wanted to buy anything. And I was surprised at how many guys loaded up.
oh yes,
I mean, they really took advantage of that.
took advantage of that. Yeah, did a wonderful
Lots
job.
of handguns.
Yeah, I seem to remember that.
Yeah.
But it was a very memorable trip. I won't ever miss another one that gets planned. I know my son, who's sitting behind us, won't. He was up on the last one we did, and he was pretty small at that time. And I know Clay would be more than willing to go. We've been placed under new ownership, so I'm not 100% sure how that will all go with Bass Pro, but I'm more than willing to.
Well, you can
Throw my
you
stick
can
out
take a
there.
run at it.
Yeah, I'm more than willing to try.
So now take us to leaving and heading to, tell us where we were gonna go fishing and how far away from your dad's house it was and the caravan and so forth.
Yes, we left Owatonna. It's about 5 hours almost to the Big Bass Lake in Cohasset, Minnesota. We stayed at the Back of the Moon Resort that time. We all piled in, loaded up. Everybody headed on up, and I believe we were there 6 days. Clay and the team were already up there pre-fishing, so he had a whole bunch of spots marked that he wanted to take, and then we had everybody signing up and going for boat rides with Clay and Danny and.
What do you remember about Rick Galley and I with Clay on his boat?
I seem to remember you got really cold. I seem to remember somebody was lipping off. I don't remember who that was. Said something about, let's see how fast this boat can go. And I believe Clay said, are you sure? Because you're going to get cold.
That's
and
right. And I was sitting up on the chair, on the fishing chair.
in the front, and you said, yeah, give it to her. So he did. And if I remember correctly, you couldn't talk when you came back.
It took a couple of hours sitting in front of the
From the fire.
fireplace. Mm-hmm. That was bad. So now we're up there, and of course it was a nice resort, and we had rooms and so forth. Tell us about the eating and the kind of what we did there.
Well, basically, all it was all about fellowship and friendship. So there was a lot of stories told. We had a crew of guys. They go up in a spring fishing trip with myself and my dad, Kenny Gowland, Ernie Zeise, Barry Tate, Dave Richards, or otherwise known as Dub. I don't remember that year. There was a couple others too. But they did all the cooking, the dishwashing, all the basic maintenance. We had breakfast every morning, lunch at noon, and then suppers were also made depending upon what day of the week it was. I seem to remember Paul Naso and Kenny going at it about spaghetti, so now
Oh, sure.
Kenny doesn't make any spaghetti, Paul makes it all. But yeah, everybody ate really well. We did a gratitude meeting just about every night, right around, sitting around a bonfire, no matter how cold it was.
And that was an amazing experience.
Yes.
I mean, there were people saying things that I never would have imagined they would have ever shared. And again, I have to say this, that was a bonding experience. Even for the guys that had served together in Vietnam, I mean, that's a close brotherhood in and of itself. But to get those guys alone out there in that situation around a campfire, and do you remember Doc had his guitar and was playing?
Yeah.
The letter?
Yep.
It was just an amazing experience. And the first night you thought, well, it can't get any better than this.
And
the
it just
second
kept
night,
getting better.
it just kept getting better. And, you know, I'll never forget, I wanted to somehow recognize those guys that volunteered to come up with us. And I did a presentation in front of all the vets to them, and we made them honorary Wolfhounds, and I gave them our challenge coin. And I'll never forget these guys that there wasn't a dry eye.
That one.
Yeah. And every time I talk to Kenny, he says, it's always with me.
It's always in the pocket.
Yep, he says, it's always with me. And you know, if they thought they were affected, man, it tore my heart apart to know how much they cared for us.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was really amazing. So the fishing trip overall, let me ask you this. Let's describe a couple of the boat trips that we were taking guys out and as an example, Russ Bruns. Okay, now a lot of people don't know this, but Russ and his two boys at the time we started this fishing trip deal, you know, sometimes families grow apart and, you know, for whatever reason. And he hadn't done anything with his boys for many years. And so he invited them to come, and they did. And, you know, I'll never forget, as long as I live, those two boys and Russ fishing. And it was like a life-changing event for them. And that one, who was it that caught the bass? Jake?
The younger brother.
And it was a nice bass. And of course, you know, those guys were just beaming. And Russ got that bass when we got back to the dock and took it up to the office and asked the guy if he could get that taxidermied.
Right.
And so Russ did that as a surprise to his kid. And Russ says, I never want to forget that moment. And by the way, just as an interesting thing, since that time, those kids have come to every Wolfhound event, and I'm sure they talk every week.
Oh, I'm sure.
I mean, so, you know, I guess when we look back at the fishing trips, it was much, much more than just fishing.
Oh, yes.
You
Always
know,
is.
There were guys that maybe for the first time in 40 years were actually able to get some closure,
Yeah.
you know, on what happened in Vietnam.
And I think that's why Dad decided to do it that way.
Yep.
There's something about the North Woods and that lake, that area.
Okay.
It's just, that's why he does it.
So tell us what your memory is of taking these old vets out on the lake.
Well, I seem to remember you got a nickname, and I'm pretty sure you're described that way all the time at Cabela's still at this point. It had something to do with a pair of scissors. Maybe you could remember what that was. You're not gonna go there, are you? I think it has something to do with a cutter.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, I'm pretty sure when we refer to
well,
Captain John Quintrell.
you have to
it's-
understand that, and I think you guys did this on purpose. He gave me the rod and reel that was guaranteed to bird's nest. I mean, there was no way, shape, or form that you couldn't.
I'm pretty sure you went through about 9 or 10 rod and
It
reels.
was awful.
I mean, we can't even prepare that many to bird's nest.
It was absolutely awful. And of course, every time it happened, you know, Clay would hand me another pole, and he'd sit there. Most of his day was spent getting the bird's nests out. And yeah, they'll never let me forget that.
No, your nickname from now on is the cutter. You will never outlive that name.
So tell us about some of the experiences that the vets had.
Well, I know there's quite a few people that went out and caught a lot of nice fish. I don't know why. It always seemed that the minute you guys got there, the fish quit biting. I just don't understand it. Clay would fill a live well
Oh.
and
I know.
And the day you showed up, that was the end. I do remember quite a few more humorous parts of it, which is Doc not wearing any socks in 60-degree weather, feet hanging out the side of a pontoon and complaining because he was cold. I seem to remember somebody catching Ole's boat, hooking into the anchor line. I seem to remember that one.
Do you remember when we night fished that time?
Yeah, I do. I do. There was a whole lot of hooting and hollering and no fish coming in the boat. A lot of screaming back and forth between boats. I seem to remember Scott Mulberg and Clay at one point in time after one of the bonfires sneaking over to steal some beef jerky out of another cabin while humming the Mission Impossible theme song.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah, there's a lot of antics and craziness, but that's typical with every fishing trip. It's more about the fun than the...
Do you remember Paul and trying to load on the boat?
Yeah, and when he fell in, yeah.
The boat just kept going away from the dock. Was that Ole's boat?
That was Ole's boat, yeah, and I remember after I heard
And
what happened...
he did the splits.
Yeah, and he fell directly in the water. And I seem to remember somebody screaming, and I came running down about halfway, and everybody started laughing. We saw Paulie in the lake, so we ran and got some Dawn dish soap, just handed it to him, told him it was time for a bath.
Yeah.
So we've had a lot of fun antics going on up at the fishing trip.
Yep.
Do you remember when Tommy Clack came on the fishing trip?
Yeah, no, I don't.
But you remember,
I remember a certain video.
yeah,
Yes.
where's Tommy Clack?
Where's Tommy Clack? I seem to remember him ending up off the end of a dock too.
In his wheelchair?
In his wheelchair, yeah.
Do you know that that's still a classic? That gets a lot of hits.
Oh yeah,
And the guy that enjoys it the most is Tommy.
Tommy.
He
sure.
just thought that was the best. And and then, we did this several times. This wasn't just a one-time deal. And every year more guys came. I
Right.
mean, it got to be a pretty big deal.
We even had to move resorts.
Yeah, yeah.
Needed bigger cabins. Yep.
Yep. And the one thing I remember the most is when we got there, your dad had made a mistake. He'd given Steve the wrong dates.
Yeah, I remember
And
that.
so we showed up, and our reservation for that was the week coming. But Steve was gracious and tried to, get things worked around, and everybody was assigned to a room except your dad, myself, Steve Klaus, and Jim Brandow. And we were four guys that were left. And do you remember you guys actually took tents and pitched up there?
Yep.
I mean, there were guys sleeping in tents up there.
Yep. Dub and I shared a tent.
And so he goes, "Oh, guys, no problem. I've got a trailer out back over there." And it was a little, I'm going to guess it wasn't longer than 25 foot,
No.
probably 8 foot by 25. And it had a double bed in the front, and it had a bed over that, and then a bed that you took the table and put it down. And so Jim and your dad had brought an air mattress. And they just put it out, and Jim and your dad were on that, and Steve Klaus was in the overhead. And in order to get in the bed, there was only 12 inches, I think. And he would get back and run and jump up and throw himself sideways into that bed. And I felt really bad
Well, yep.
for him. And then I was over there right next to the bathroom on this bed. And apparently Steve had not winterized that trailer because the smell from the holding tank was wafting in my face it was awful. And of course, these old vets got to get up 3 or 4 times a night
Yep.
to go out and relieve themselves. And every time your dad would get off that thing, Jim would go down.
Right.
And then when he'd get back in, Jim would bounce.
launched out in the
Oh
lake,
my
yeah.
God, that was funny. That was one of the, it was horrible, but it was hilarious. I
Right.
mean, and then I think it was the last 2 days they got us, they actually, because the other
People
groups,
have left,
they were
yeah.
leaving. And Jim and I shared a room, and that was the best 2 days of our life on that resort, because we actually got to sleep in a bed.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, a lot of those fishing trips have gone that way. And that's part of the fun.
Oh, yeah. And then another thing, I remember when you told us we were gonna catch sunfish. Mm-hmm. And they were those
Big monsters, and you couldn't find them.
with a cane pole. Mm-hmm. And that was like old time hockey, right? You had
Yeah.
a bamboo pole.
Stick with a piece of line on the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, I'll tell you, those trips were life-changing for so many guys. And, it's been all about, trying to get guys, closure on what happened in Vietnam. And I've told you this, and I know your dad's told you, that a veteran can go anywhere he wants and try to get help. He can go to a counselor, he can go to a priest or a rabbi. But there's no healing that takes place like it is with the guy that was with you.
Right.
If you were with this guy and you were next to somebody when they got killed, and the both of you were right there, that bond.
Right.
Never, that stays with you the rest of your life. So who can you talk to about that? The guy that was there.
Right.
It does no good to tell a counselor because they have no
No
clue,
idea. Sure.
So, and the fishing trip allowed a lot of that, And then I remember we also had the local newspaper come up
Yep.
and tell us a little bit about that.
They came up and this was, I think, on the third trip up there. They came up and did some interviews, and I know Dad's got about 3 or 4 copies. It was front page news for the Grand Rapids newspaper.
Yep, and it's on it's on our website, isn't it, Tim?
I think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they came up and did a whole bunch of interviews. It was a pretty cool time. I believe they were there a good 2 or 3 hours.
And then they came back the next trip.
And they came back the next trip. And I would assume if we go again, they're gonna come back again.
Yep.
So it's kind of cool to see all the local people get involved. I know that Jim Cabela himself was pretty touched by the whole thing. There was one of your wood plaques and my picture, and I know you guys went down and visited with Tommy Milner, who at the time was the CEO of Cabela's, and I still talk to him not on a regular basis, but once or twice a year, which is pretty awesome to be able to talk to somebody that was that high ranking.
Well, I'll tell you, I told Tommy we were coming to Owatonna, and he and I are in touch practically 2-3 times a week. Mm-hmm. And as you know, he's one of our main financial sponsors for what we're doing here. And if you ever get a chance, go and watch his interview.
Okay.
It's an amazing interview. But I said, we're going to Owatonna, and I'm going to be interviewing Matt. You know what he said? I've always loved that guy.
Yeah.
I've always loved that guy.
And Tommy is pretty much a class act. He was a CEO of a multi-million-dollar company, and
Remington Firearms for what, 10 years,
10
12 years?
Yeah, and then Cabela's, I'm not sure how long he was at Cabela's. But I'd have to say, for a guy that's that high ranking, he's just a normal Joe.
You bet.
And kind of like that. I've actually got his cell phone number, and I've talked to him numerous times on the phone. And I got to meet. Well, I had met him before, but I got to have some conversations with Jim Cabela at a time. So it was pretty cool for a little farm kid who grew up fishing out of a river and catching crawdads to get to that big of a point.
Now I'd like to take us to a recognition program that Cabela's has called the Founders Award.
Yes.
I think you forgot something very important, though. We never talked about, of all the fishing trips, who caught the biggest fish.
Oh.
And the guide that was represented at the time, who had the courage and the strength to get that angler to his finest hour in his life. What do you guys remember about that? The biggest fish ever caught on any fishing trip of all time? Do you remember, guys?
Well, I seem to remember I caught the biggest fish on the fishing trip.
I don't know.
I got a picture if you want to see it. I'm just saying.
Well, and then they ended up mounting that at the office of the resort.
Yeah,
I got a $75 credit.
Yes,
Yeah, I seem to remember Tim catching a pretty nice northern up there.
Yep.
And then I thought we were fishing for walleye, but no one ever caught a walleye.
No, well, I did, but just not with you guys.
And that, you're the only guy that had 700 yards of spool out.
Yes.
He had, from one lake, he was trolling about a 10-foot window by the time he'd make the turn at the other end of the lake.
Kirk Moe, one of the professional fishermen that came up
Yep.
one year, Tim and I fished with him, and he had this set up where he could send outriggers, 50 feet out to each side of the boat. I'd never seen those before.
Planers.
Planer boards. Yep.
Planers, yeah.
Planer boards, yep.
And he said, we're in them, we're gonna be in them any minute. And we put on hours of, and never, not one.
I don't know what it was, but I think it was because they knew you were gonna get
Wow.
tangled up. So they, the fish just decided they weren't gonna bite.
Well, let's get back to the, let's get back to the Founders Award. Tell us about that.
Well, after we had made that rod holder for Dick, he wrote a bunch of letters, unbeknownst to me, to Cabela's corporate headquarters. I honestly didn't know anything about the letters going there. And it was after we had built that rod holder, which my general manager made sure that we had enough money and boats and people and resources to make that all happen. Clay and I sat down in order to make that rod holder. We brought parts from about 9 different stores across the country because we didn't have all the pieces and parts in our store. And then we sat down, put it together. And when we got up there, we talked to the resort owner. He let us drill a hole in the bottom of his pontoon
That's right, I remember that.
to put a seat plate in so we could mount the holder. So we spent a little time in some cold water for a while with a beach pontoon, and we got it all installed, and Dick was so impressed, he wrote letters. I think Joe did, I believe you did,
I tried to get everybody to write.
and everybody wrote in letters, which I'm highly thankful for. I didn't know what was going on. I thought, well, we just had a great fishing trip.
Well,
and
the
that's-
Founders Award, as I recall, was a secret.
It was.
I mean, that was the best-kept corporate secret of all times. In other words, nobody
Nobody knew.
knew.
And the Founders Award was an award that was dedicated to one or two Cabela's employees that exemplified the founders' virtues, meaning Dick and Jim used to camp out and go to different sales shows. They were huge innovators in the sporting goods world as far as inventing a lot of things that now sportsmen use on a regular basis. So you had to meet a whole bunch of criteria in order to get that award. They gave, I think, 9 total.
It's the biggest
It's-
prestigious award.
It's the
they
biggest
have.
one they offered.
Yep.
So you guys writing letters actually got me nominated for the Founders Award, and our marketing manager at that time, which was Danny Thompson, we didn't know anything about it. They told us we were going to a corporate meeting in Denver. When we got there, there was a concierge. We ended up in the top of a hotel in a suite. Each had our own suite. And then we were presented with the Founders Award, where you and Joe Wascom and Dick,
But you didn't know we were there.
I had no idea.
You didn't know your folks were there.
Didn't know my folks were there. Didn't know my brother was
That's
there.
how secret
Yeah.
that was kept. And I just have to tell you, they hid us, literally, for a day. They hid us.
They had to.
And so when the presentation was presented, they had us come up the side of the stage.
Yep.
And it was Joe and me and Dick and who else was there?
Dick was there too.
And
wasn't he?
Moose, your dad.
And Dad.
And of course, they stood us up there, and I had no idea we didn't know what was going on. We just thought we were gonna shake your hand, right? Because you had won the award. And Tommy Milner got up there and he started talking about veterans. And before he was through, he said, if you've ever served, and there was 500 people in that auditorium.
At least.
At least. He said, if you've ever served, would you please stand up? And I was absolutely stunned at how many Cabela's employees are veterans. Were you like surprised?
I was amazed.
You know, and he goes, okay, guys, make yourself to the aisles. I want every one of you to come up on stage and shake every one of these veterans' hands. And that was one of the most emotional.
It was cool. There wasn't room on the stage.
Yeah,
We still had people
and,
standing out in the hall.
but I'm telling you, that, you know, and that, right then and there, if I would have never talked to Tommy Milner again in my life, I knew what kind of guy he was, you know? And then, so what did you think? What did you feel when you won that award?
I was amazed. Didn't expect anything of it. It didn't need it.
Yeah,
The trip was, in itself, was the joy. I mean, it's a lot of hard work coordinating that, getting all those stores to send parts and pieces, getting everybody's schedules rearranged, and getting everybody paid so that they can support their families while they go up on a trip like that. Coordinating timing and events.
smoking pork chops.
Smoking pork chops takes forever. But the trip in itself was worth it to me. I didn't need any recognition or an award. I'm truly grateful that it happened. I think we made some more connections through that. I seem to remember you did something for Tommy too,
Yeah,
which is very admirable. I think he's been touched by that and
oh
will
yeah,
be forever.
very much so.
So, to me, the trip was enough.
Yeah.
The award was amazing, but the
Yeah.
trip was enough.
And as far as the vets were concerned, we were so happy that you got it. I mean, we were invested in you, you know, and boy, that was just perfect for us. Well, you know, in bringing this to a close, I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask you.
Sure.
What is your definition of a hero?
Anybody that's willing to put their life on the line for this country, to do something for somebody else greater than themselves.
Is your dad a hero?
Oh, of course he is. Anybody can tolerate me. Come on. You guys all are. That's why we did it.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, and as far as Clay's concerned, and anybody that was ever involved, that's why we do it all the time.
Yep. And what does the flag mean to you, the American flag?
It means the world to me. That's our country. That's what we stand for. That's why we're here. We're one of the greatest nations in the world, and that flag represents it. And I hope it stays that way.
Yep. And my final question to you, Matt, is when Avery is old enough to get on his computer and watch this interview, and then generations after generations following him are able to get on and see you talk, I just want you to look in the camera and I want you to express yourself as far as what you hope for them and what you would advise. What advice would you give these young folks as they're coming up?
My advice would be, first and foremost, to not sweat the small stuff, and it's all small stuff. Honor those people that put their life on the line for you, and you go that extra mile. Do the extra part, even if it's tough, even if it's hard, even if it's painful, whatever the case may be. Do it anyway, because you'll never regret it. And you mean when he can look it up on the computer and watch the video, you mean like tomorrow? Because you do realize he's been back there playing on an iPad for what, an hour now?
But
You know, I'd like to know, if your dad was sitting here next to you, what would you tell your dad about his service? If it was just you and your dad in the room and someone said, listen, you know, your dad's not gonna be here forever, what would you wanna tell your dad that everybody would treasure and your family's gonna really treasure about his service?
That it's amazing that what he did was above and beyond what anybody I know, other than you guys, would ever do. You know, and all the stuff that happened afterwards. You know, when he went in, he was nothing but a 18-year-old kid. I've seen the pictures. He looks very similar to Avery.
yeah,
And he doesn't look anything like that at all now. Anybody that can go through that kind of thing and survive as long as he has.
well, and your dad got hurt really bad.
Very
I mean,
bad.
I'm going to say that right up front. He was one of the guys that got hurt really bad.
Yeah, I remember having many a conversation with Doc about it, and you know, to go through that and to continue to live life and stay positive and go through all the wonderful repercussions of that experience, amazing.
Yeah.
More powerful than anybody I could ever imagine.
Yep, and Tim and I had breakfast with one of his friends this morning, and one of the things that'll stay with me forever is he said about your dad, he says, you know what? That guy has dedicated his life to others. He just serves others and wants to help others in any way he can.
Yep, that
And
is
that
very
pretty
true.
much sums it up, doesn't it?
Very true.
So, you've got the floor. What do you want, how do you want to finish this?
I guess I don't know.
I mean,
I'm
sir,
just glad I was able to participate.
yep, we are too.
You know, back, I remember as a kid growing up, when I was Avery's size, Dad didn't talk about any of this. He kept that all to himself.
Yep.
My brother and I used to always talk about his 18 belly buttons, because of where all the tubes and stuff, you know, and those of you who've been around him, when he wakes up in the morning, he doesn't exactly wear a lot of clothes. So we were able to see all the scars and the issues. And I didn't know this side until we started going to the reunions and doing the fishing trips. So now he doesn't shut up about it. And that's okay.
And you know what? That's the power of actually being able to come to grips with it through being with the guys, through
Right.
being with the guys that were there with him.
Right, and I'm forever grateful for that.
Yep.
And we've made some amazing friends like you and Tim and Scotty and you know, all the guys.
Yep.
Jim Brandow. I talk to Paulie fairly often. In fact, my son, who's 4, knows who Paulie is. He talks to Paulie on a regular basis, and Dick, and those guys are all over the nation.
Yep.
So made some great friends and connections over the years over doing it, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Well, Matt, thank you again for coming and spending your time with us today.
No problem.
This is not only means a lot to me, but when people view this is going to be a phenomenal interview.
Oh yeah,
And so thank you so much.
you're very welcome.
Okay, buddy.